like to take that as one of their HPE elective theory classes. In motor learning, we're looking at how does the brain learn a new skill, right? So the ideas are things that help us identify whether the brain is learning, right? Because we can't see that. We have to find ways of recognizing learning as an abstract idea. Right? So one of the things we have to do when we look at the motor learning literature is think about how we classify skills, because what we find if we're reading this information is that actually not all skills work the same way. So am I doing something once? Am I repeating the same thing over and over again? Or am I trying to string together lots of different skills in a variable order? All right? And the way that the brain works is a little bit different for each of those, so it helps if we can identify what type of skill it is. Okay, so we're going to look at some classification systems for motor skills, and we'll also talk about the difference between a skill and an ability. Right? So we'll look at some of the information we know about motor abilities. How much ability do I have to do a particular thing? Right? Because it would help if I can identify the things I don't have the ability for, then that might not be the good route to take if I'm trying to encourage someone to be physically active. Let's put them into an activity where they've got more chance of being successful so that it's more enjoyable. Right? So what do we want to know? We want to know what types of skills people learn. How rapidly can they learn? So as a coach, that can sometimes be important. Right? I don't have a year for them to learn this skill. They come in as a new person on the team, and we have to play our first game in 6 weeks. Is it possible for me to teach them this skill, or should I try to work around it at this point? How well do they retain what we learn? So retention is a crucial part of learning. When I say to you guys, don't memorize for your exams, because memorizing is not learning. And memories are not retained. Right? When you cram for an exam in 3 weeks' time, you would have to cram all over again to take the same exam, right? Because you didn't learn. Right? So how well do we retain a skill is very important, because I don't really want to have to teach the same skill over and over again every time we have PE. We want that skill learned as a foundation so we can build on it and start to put skills together in games. Okay. So the skill is the actual task, just to make sure we're all using the same terminology. And a skill would have a specific goal that we're trying to achieve. Right? And sometimes you'll see the term motor action rather than motor skill. Depends where you're reading. Right? Skilled then is how well I do the skill. What's the quality of the movement pattern that I produce? Can you see this word on the...
I think it'll be better if you turn the light off, actually.
Turn the light off. All right, so our first form of classification is a very simple, one-dimensional continuum type idea, and it puts skill characteristics together that are similar. So I can use it to identify skills that have similar aspects to them. And so we use a continuum to do this, and I lent my black pen to someone else. Can you see the blue if I write in the blue?
Oh, I can see the board, yeah. Dry erase.
So we have a continuum with two categories, one on each end, that represent extremes for identifying this skill. And we have three one-dimensional classifications that we use. And so I can identify a skill under any one of these classifications. The first one is the size of the muscle group that's being used to do the main part of the skill. So am I using big muscles to do the skill, or am I using little tiny muscles to use the skill? The second one is, where does the action start and where does the action finish? Does it have a very distinct beginning and end to it? And the third classification is actually about the environment that the skill is occurring within. So do I do it in a nice quiet gym with no one around me? Am I out in the middle of a field with 50 other people running around like crazy? Okay, where's the skill occurring? So the first one then, size of primary musculature. The terminology should look relatively familiar to you because we've already spent the semester talking about gross motor skills and fine motor skills. All right, so on one end we have gross motor skills, skills that require large muscle groups to get them done. All right? And on the other end, fine motor skills, little small movements. So walking, hopping, jumping, catching would be gross. Signing your name, writing, buttoning a shirt, or using a keyboard are fine motor skills. Right? Reading is a fine motor skill. Now, when we look at sports skills then, we often have skills that are a combination, because if we say catching and throwing are gross motor skills, predominantly they would fall under a gross motor umbrella. But if I'm going to catch a ball, I have to use my fingers. That would be a fine motor skill. If I'm a pitcher and I'm going to put spin on the ball, then I would have to have some fine motor control as well. All right? So when we look at very many sports skills, what we see is they wouldn't be extreme. They don't lie on either end of the continuum. They would have to lie somewhere in the middle because they kind of use a little bit of both. Right? Make sense? So, category number 2, where did the action start and where did it finish? So on one end we have continuous motor skills, and what we see with a continuous motor skill is that the beginning is arbitrary. There's not a distinct end point to the motor pattern. Often very repetitive movements like steering a car, walking, running, riding a bike would all be continuous. I have to do the same motor pattern over and over again in order to achieve the goal of the movement. On the other end of the continuum, we have discrete motor skills. So, very specific start with a very specific finish to the motor pattern that delineates that skill. So a very defined, specific, single movement. So hitting a piano key would be discrete, just pressing one key. Turning on a light switch, start and finish. Catching a ball, start and finish. Running, swimming, I have to repeat the same movement pattern over and over again. So they're continuous, right? Throwing, catching would be discrete, because although I can do it more than once, I have to, there's a break, right? Unless I'm standing in front of a pitching machine catching every ball, then there's a break between catch one and catch two. Okay? It stands alone as a skill. Right? So in this particular classification, we have a third category that we sometimes see where we've got a series of discrete skills. So if I hit a piano key, that's a discrete skill. But if I play a tune, then I'm doing lots of discrete movements and putting them together in a series. So it's called a serial. It's not exactly continuous because I don't press the same key over and over and over again. Right? I have to press lots of different keys, so I have to do lots of different discrete skills and put them together. So if I'm, gymnastics is an easy one to use here. If you watch a floor routine, right, and these days the girls get to the corner and they stand there for 500 hours before they do their tumble run, right? And they stand there and stand. And then they run, and then they cartwheel, and then they back handspring, and then they somersault. So a cartwheel is a discrete skill. A back handspring is a discrete skill. A somersault is a discrete skill, but I put them all together in a series, and that would fit. The tumbling run would fit under a serial motor skill. Make sense? So if you drive a manual car, right? Don't see that as often over here as at home, but if you drive a manual, then changing gear is a serial motor skill. Steering the car, driving the car is a continuous motor skill, hopefully. Right? And the third one then is what's going on in the environment. So what we're interested in when you're looking at the environment is how stable is the environment that the skill is occurring within, because that impacts what I need to emphasize when I'm teaching the skill. Right? So one end we have open motor skills, so there's lots of movement in the environment. The surface might be moving, there might be an object involved that is moving, there might be other people in the environment. The other extreme is a closed environment. So a closed motor skill occurs in an environment that is pretty stationary. It's almost the same every time you do the skill. The surface is stable, there aren't objects flying around, there aren't other people involved. Right? So a very predictable environment for the skill to occur. So driving the car then would be an open motor skill typically. You could argue in New Mexico that you can drive all the way to Roswell without seeing another car. So is it really an open skill if there's nothing else on the road, right? But usually driving a car is a pretty open skill. There's other cars on the road, there might be pedestrians, you have to stop-start in relation to a traffic light, right? Catching a ball is an open motor skill. Why? How do you think catching counts as open? Where's the motion?
Because you could be moving while you're catching the ball. And you could be running a route or something. And football, when you're running and you catch when you're running.
Right, but you moving doesn't dictate the environment. What's moving in the environment? There you go, you were close, good. Right, the ball is moving. So catching identifies as an open skill because there's something moving that is involved in the skill. Right? Walking in a crowd. So if I'm walking at the mall on a Saturday when it's busy, right, and I'm having to dodge around women with push chairs and kids on their rollerblades or, right, then that's an open skill. If I'm running a football play, Alex's example, that's an open skill because I'm having to dodge other players, right, and they're never going to be in the same place twice, ideally. If I'm coaching, I don't want them in the same place twice because that would let the other team know where they were going to be and they'd know what to do. Right? So part of the skill of playing team games is how quickly can I recognize what the other team might do in this situation. Closed motor skills, picking up a cup. Hopefully the cup is on a stationary surface, otherwise it's a little bit dodgy, right? Buttoning a shirt, nothing else is involved, there's no movement. Throwing is a closed skill because the ball isn't moving when I throw. Until I release it, there's no motion in the... Now, if I'm throwing in the middle of a game, and it's not a free throw, right? Because the rules are in a free throw, no one's allowed to crowd you, right? You get space, you're in charge of the ball. Very close. If I'm throwing and trying to score a goal in the middle of the game when people are running at me, it moves a little bit further down the continuum now because there are people there. But the skill itself is quite close. Make sense? So I can use these categories then to look at the literature and decide what's the best way to teach a skill that is more open versus a skill that is more closed. Right? So there's all kinds of problems. We've got lots of literature on one-dimensional classifications because they've been around forever. And they're very useful to a point, right? But even just as you're thinking about your own experiences in skills, I'm sure you can come up with skills that it would be quite tricky to really pinpoint on one of those continuums because sport skills are so complicated. Right? So, more recently, a researcher decided that she was a bit fed up with having to deal with these one-dimensional classifications. She wanted something that was a little more descriptive, that gave her more options for classifying skills. And so she came up with a two-dimensional classification system, which is beginning to get used a lot more in the literature now. We don't have anywhere near the amount of information on how to use the two-dimensional one from a coaching, teaching perspective specifically, but we're getting more. And I think you'll see more of this if you're coaching and reading coaching journals, or if you're a PE teacher and you're reading Joe Perd or any of the PE type journals, then you're going to see this classification used more often as we start to research with it. And there's a copy of the matrix for this classification on Blackboard. All right, so I'll go through that matrix in a minute with you. So she decided that she was going to create this two-dimensional, so it's on like an XY axis grid type idea, and she was going to use two general characteristics. One was going to be something to do with the environment, and one was going to be the function of the action. So, and then she subdivided those characteristics. So her environmental idea, she subdivided into regulatory conditions, and under regulatory conditions, she was looking at, is the environment stationary? So she took the closed open continuum and built it into her new category. Or is the environment in motion? So what characteristic of the environmental context determines what happens with the movement? And then her other idea was looking at the variability between trials. So do the environmental characteristics stay the same every time you do the skill, or do the environmental characteristics change? So are they absent, in which case there's no variability, right? Or do we have inter-trial variability? Is it present? And therefore, every time I do the skill, the environment is different. Right? So, a stationary skill then would be a free throw, right? The environment is very stable. No one's allowed to interfere. There's nothing moving in the environment until I release the ball. And a free throw, in theory, should be absent of inter-trial variability, preferably, right? Every time I do it, the environment is the same. Now you might come off of that a little bit because different arenas look slightly different. They might have different color backgrounds behind the backboard. So maybe it's a little bit different from trial to trial, but on the day that you're doing it, every time you play the ball, the environment would be the same. If I look at something that would be in motion, then I could say a forehand in a tennis game, right? If I'm going to hit a forehand, or if I'm going to hit a forehand from a tennis projector. So, if I'm going to hit it from a ball projector, then there's less variability. Now you can set the projector to add variability, or I could set the projector to send the same ball out every time, right? So it comes with about the same force, on the same angle, it's going to land in about the same place on the court every time, and I can practice hitting my forehand. So that would be in motion but absent. But if I'm hitting a forehand in a game, is the person I'm playing going to hit the ball to exactly the same place every time? No, because they want to win the game, right? So they're going to move the ball around as much as possible, make it as difficult for me to hit my forehand as possible. So now I have in motion, because the ball is moving, but I've got inter-trial variability because who knows what type of ball is coming for me to hit. Then her other idea function of action. So if I'm looking at the environment, and I'm also going to combine in what's the function of the action. So the first thing she wanted to include here was body orientation. So Alex mentioned the fact that I would be moving in order to catch the ball. Right? So is the body stable? Is it stationary? Or is the body moving? Is it in transport? And then the other part of the action that she wanted to look at was object manipulation. So is there an object present or absent? Okay. So that gives us 16 categories when we put all these ideas together, and what we end up with is our table. So I'm going to turn the light on briefly so I can show you how to use the matrix. And there's, depending on which book you look at, there's a couple of different versions. This is the one I have scanned in and up, but they're all basically the same. There's a more updated one that uses slightly more user-friendly language, I think, but it's the same matrix. All right. So when you first look at this, and you've got to identify this skill, and you've got 16 boxes the skill could go in, it can feel a little overwhelming, because how do I decide which box the skill fits in? But actually, it's relatively simple, at least initially, to work that out, because we put the action function across the top, so it's on that x-axis if you were thinking two-dimension, and the environment is on the side. So if I start with the function of the action, because they're basically yes-no questions, they're very easy to answer. All right, so the first line is the body stability idea, body orientation. Am I moving or am I stationary? Well, when I'm watching a skill, that's very easy. Are they moving, are they stationary? Yes or no? Right? So as soon as I answer yes or no to that question, it cuts me down to only 2 columns out of the 4 columns. So it immediately makes my job simpler. Well, the next part of the function of the action is also a yes-no question. So again, very simple for me to identify, do they need an object or not to do this skill? So no object manipulation or object manipulation. Yes, no, and as soon as I answer that, now I'm down to just 1 column. Okay? Now comes the slightly trickier bit, because now we have to tackle the environment. So having got myself down to 1 column, then I've got to decide, is the context stationary or is it in motion? So what's the regulatory condition? Is the context stationary, relatively stable, or is there lots of movement in the environment? All right? That can be tricky depending upon the skill. It can be relatively easy if it's just catching a ball, because as soon as there's movement of an object, we have in motion regulatory conditions. Right? If I'm walking on concrete, the surface is stable. But if I'm walking on the sand, the surface isn't stable. Right? There's much more movement in the surface on the sand. So it can be relatively straightforward to answer stability or in motion, or it can be a little tricky. So you have to pay attention to what's going on in the environment. But once I've answered the question, now I'm down to only 2 rows on so 1 column and 2 rows. And then my final question is going to be this inter-trial variability. Is the environment the same every time they do it, or is it different every time they do it? Okay. So, if I'm coaching a gymnast to do a beam routine, the environment is the same every time she does it. The beam is 4 inches wide, it's X distance off the floor, and that is the same no matter where you are in the world if you're going to compete in gymnastics. So the beam is the beam is the beam no matter where, right? The arena may change, but the beam is the same. If I'm working with a quarterback, is anything ever the same every time they have to catch the ball? Right? Never. It's different every single time. There's a huge amount of variability in what happens when they catch. Isn't there?
Yeah, quarterbacks throw the ball.
Oh, oops, sorry. Okay, whoever catches the ball. Jeez, guys. I'm All right, so it actually is not as difficult to work out which box your skill wants to go in at that point in time. The currently really useful thing about this grid, right, the most useful use of the grid right now, is that if I start up in the top left-hand corner, right, so I'm in box 1A, that means I'm stationary, right? I have no object to manipulate. My environment is very stable, and there's not going to be any variability when I try this skill over and over. That is the simplest version of a skill you could create as a PE teacher or a coach. Yes? Right? The person is stable, the environment is stable, I'm not making them use an object yet, and nothing's going to change. If I go to the bottom right-hand corner though, now I've got the person is moving, they're having to manipulate an object, the environment is moving, not stable, and every time I ask them to do it, it's going to be different. That is the most complicated version of a skill that I can create. Right? So depending upon the skill, I may actually be able to start up here, but obviously if it's throwing or catching, I can't start in box 1A because there's an object involved, right? So I might have to start in 1B. But we can use the chart to create another way of developing the skill within my lesson plan, right? So last week we looked at the task analysis in chapter 18, but you could use Gentile's taxonomy in a very similar way. If this is the skill I want them to learn, and it's down here somewhere, how do I make it easier for them to start to teach it, right? Because if I chuck them in down here, it's not going to be successful. It won't work. Does that make sense? So the taxonomy, you'll see a lot of literature out there at the moment about how to use the classification system to be developmentally appropriate in your skill progressions, in your lesson plans, or in your coaching plan. Right now, we don't have as much information on how do I use the two-dimensional idea with regards to how should I teach a particular skill, which we have with the one dimension. If it's an open skill, you should do this, right? When do you give feedback? Depends what kind of skill it is, right? How do I prepare practice? Do I do lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of repetitions, or do I not? How long do I take between repetitions? Do I do repetitions every day of the week or only on Monday and Friday? Right? All those kinds of ideas we've got some answers to when we look at the one-dimensional classification, but we don't have the same amount of detail when we're looking at this two-dimensional idea. Okay, so let's look at the idea of motor abilities, because some of you took 313 ahead of 212, and you already are aware of the idea that we often incorrectly tell children that they can do anything they try, right? As long as they work hard enough, they can do anything. This is clearly wrong. So motor abilities are a very similar idea to that, all right? We should not tell every child that they can do anything they want to do, right? Because they can't. They can't. They're not built to do that. So they won't ever be successful at it, right? They may be okay, but what if they don't want to be okay? What if they want to be brilliant? Then we set them up for an unhappy journey, right? So what we have is very many abilities that relate to motor skills and how we learn and how successful we can be, right? So when we're looking at motor abilities, we're looking specifically at things that would impact a movement skill. An ability is the capacity of the person to achieve a successful outcome on a particular task, right? So we have math abilities, right? We have language abilities. We have motor abilities. Not everybody has the same level of every ability, okay? And we can use the idea of a motor ability to identify someone's potential for a particular skill, right? So how do we decide what is successful, right? So if I'm teaching PE and I have to decide whether an individual in my PE class is successful or not, does everybody have to hit the same bar? No. I don't think so, right? Because I think that using the concept of motor abilities makes it inappropriate to expect everybody to reach the same bar. So if I'm teaching PE, then I have to say this person worked really, really hard and they improved and now they can do this. It's not the best version of the skill, but this is so much better than where they were at the beginning of the semester, right? Is that successful? I think yes. If you use a product outcome where what counts is how far they jumped, now you've got a problem, because do they make the distance? Right? So it's an interesting idea. Not everybody uses it when they're teaching in the way I would like to see it, because I don't think we should globalize everybody. Everybody shouldn't have to reach the same bar. The bar should be individually set. I would love to do that in class, but they make you get A, B's, and C's, right? My preference would be the people that get the A are the people that work the hardest in class, right? But I'm not allowed to do that, right? You have to show some proficiency in the material, and I have to set a bar for you to pass. It's not really appropriate, I don't think, but that's the way they have it set up, right? So do we have a general motor ability, right? Is someone just good at moving, or do we have specific motor abilities that change what we can and can't be good at when we look at a wide repertoire of moving. So historically, we used to think that we had a general motor ability, all right? We would say that that person was an all-around athlete. If they're really good at soccer and they're pretty good at basketball, then we assume they can swim, right? But swimming has nothing to do with ball control. So why would they be good at swimming, right? An all-around athlete is a bit of a myth. There are some people who have such a good collection of abilities that the way we have our game set up, they end up being quite successful at several different things. But you don't see that, you don't see someone be really, really good in a sport, in more than one sport very often. That's why we have heptathlons and things, right? If you look at how fast someone runs the 100 meters in a heptathlon, they would not make it to the semifinals in the 100-meter race. And yet they can win the heptathlon because they're reasonably good at lots of different things. Right? Who was the American runner who got caught? Marion Jones. So Marion Jones was an American sprinter, brilliant sprinter. Unfortunately got caught for illegal substance abuse and was stripped of her Olympic medals. Brilliant athlete, regardless of what she did or did not take. Absolutely phenomenal. They actually locked her up for a little while. When she was released, she went on to play semi-pro basketball. That is highly unusual. That you could be an Olympic gold medalist and a semi-pro athlete at a completely different sport. Highly unusual, right? She's a very, very gifted lady. Most of us, not so much. In general, most of us have a little bit of ability at lots of things and not a lot of ability at anything. So there was quite a lot of work done identifying what would count as a motor ability. And early in the 80s, when that stopped, no one kind of really picked up and ran with it. So you don't see a lot of updated information on this. Generally, when you're reading about abilities, they go back and they quote and reference this chat, which is a shame. It would be nice to see something more recent. But people are investigating other ideas right now. So he did a lot of work trying to look at the difference between skill and ability, right? What is the skill? How skilled am I is not the same as my ability, right? What ability do I have? So he decided that in general, these abilities that he identified fell into two main categories. They were either perceptual motor or they were physical proficiency type ideas. He didn't manage to create an exhaustive list. He didn't really look at balance. And so when I first started graduate work and was going to conference, there used to be a lot of argument about whether balance was a skill or an ability. Can I teach balance? Because if it's a skill, I can teach it. If it's an ability, it's the person's potential, it's genetic. Okay? So there was a lot of argument when I first started out on whether balance is a skill or an ability. Can I teach balance? Or do people have an inherent ability to balance? I don't know that we've really resolved that. We do have balance programs now, and the results with older people do suggest that they can improve their balance if they do these programs. But do they improve because they learn how to balance, or because they reawoke an ability to balance they already had, that they hadn't practiced, right? It's a very tricky kind of chicken and egg type question. So balance, we're not sure. I think most people would argue that that static balance is probably an ability, dynamic balance might be more skill driven. Visual acuity and tracking, so we don't, how much of that is ability and how much of it is skill? How much of it do we learn because we do a lot of visual tracking, right? So if I'm going to catch a ball, then is there a level of genetics? Is there a link between my ability to see and track the ball and my catching? Or is it purely experience? You don't know, because we haven't done the work on it to answer the question. And hand-eye coordination as well. It has to be close, I'm sorry. I don't have a choice. Trust me, it's a pain in the neck. It's going to be a real nuisance until they decide to come and put new locks on all the doors, and then it will get better. So, perceptual motor abilities, some of the things that Fleischmann identified that he felt would fit under this category. So, multi-limb coordination, right? So if I'm playing an organ, a really fancy organ, then all kinds of things are going on. I've got one hand pulling out levers up here, I've got one hand playing keys, I've got one foot pushing a pedal to make it louder, I've got one foot pushing a pedal to make it richer, right? There's all kinds of different things going on to play a really complicated organ. So multi-limb coordination would be hugely important to be successful at that task. Okay? Reaction time. So we mentioned the other day that reaction time is a genetic concept, that we really don't have control over reaction time. We can improve movement time and therefore speed up response time, or we can anticipate and start reacting early, but my actual reaction time is genetically determined. Wrist finger speed. So how quickly I can move my fingers and my wrist. Probably an ability, not a skill. Doesn't mean I can't get better if I practice something, because without practice I wouldn't have reached my potential, right? So doesn't mean that someone's not going to improve at all at a new skill they introduce. It's more to do with what do I expect them to actually be able to do? Like, how good are they going to get at this skill? What should my expectation of their performance be? Right? So if you have someone that has quite slow finger movements and control, then playing a piano is probably going to be frustrating for them, because they might be okay at the lower scales where it's nice and slow, but if you start trying to ask them to play a complicated piano piece, they won't be able to do that very well, and it will be frustrating. Physical proficiency abilities might be a little more obvious because you're movement specialists and you would see these all the time. Static and dynamic strength. So how strong is someone? Right? Flexibility. Gross body coordination, stamina. So aerobic capacity. Highly genetically determined. Right? I can run and run and run and run. Doesn't mean I'm ever going to be really good at running. I can run a marathon, but it's never going to be fast. Right? That's stamina, endurance, aerobic capacity would all be under physical proficiency abilities. So, the idea then is that everybody has the abilities at some level, right? It's not like I'm missing this ability completely, I just don't have very much of it. Someone else might have lots and lots and lots. I can't compare myself to someone else, I can only compare myself to me. Have I improved? Not did I improve as much as the next person, because that's an inappropriate comparison if you're using this idea. So everybody's got them, therefore they're quantifiable. So if you want to be a brain surgeon, right, then at some point, the people that are in charge of trying to teach you to be a brain surgeon, or maybe even to get into the program, you will have to do some arm-hand steadiness, finger dexterities type things. Right? I think if I'm having brain surgery, I would quite like the person with the knife to have a very steady hand. Right? So maybe if I have someone that is low on that ability, that might not be a good job idea. Right? The military use the idea of abilities a lot. Certain types of construction and tasks for within building a car, right? If you're looking at the construction line, right? The person who's got to put the little nut and bolt into the hole in a very quick amount of time is not the person that doesn't have very good hand steadiness. In the military, if you want to fly a Black Hawk, then they're going to run you through all kinds of tests, because it costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to train one of those pilots. They ain't spending that money on someone that is going to crash the plane because they don't have the right ability to fly the plane properly. Right? So they're quantifiable, and therefore we can use the idea of them, if we pay attention, for prediction of the performance. What is this person's potential for this particular type of performance? Right? And how do I evaluate then how much improvement they've made within what I'm saying their capability for that performance is? Right? So it's a way of being highly appropriate in trying to evaluate individuals, not as a group. But it's very time consuming. So do I want to do it for my pilot? Absolutely. Do I need to do it in my PE class? Maybe I want to use some of the ideas and not all of them. So it can also help us when we're teaching if we've got someone that's really struggling with something. So it's, I said, theories aren't right or wrong. Constraints theory is a great idea. What we're looking at here would be individual type constraints, right? Is there an ability that I can identify that this person is not very strong in? How do I help them with this skill that they need to do for class? So I can develop a lesson plan that's going to work on a particular type of ability and see if that helps this person. Bless you. But then I have to evaluate the ability that I set the lesson plan for, not the skill necessarily. All right? Or I have to evaluate part of the skill that relates to the ability I was trying to help them with. So, for example, you could set up a unit on tennis serving, and ahead of time you think, okay, if I'm going to teach serving and I'm paying attention to individual abilities, what abilities would impact how well someone can serve, right? Well, they have to grip the racket very firmly. So they need static grip strength. Right? They've got to have one leg in front of the other possibly, right? Are they going to jump off both legs? Are they going to push off one leg and then jump off the other leg? What stance am I going to teach? Is it going to involve multi-limb coordination? Are both legs going to do the same thing? Okay. Ball toss, loads of coordination. So one hand's going to do one thing, the other hand has to do something completely different. Backswing, I've got to have dynamic strength in my shoulder to hold the racket and swing the racket fast enough to hit the ball. Right? So I can work out what kind of abilities do I need to be relatively successful at serving, and then I can set up my lesson plans to work on particular abilities and then feed them into the skill rather than try to do it the other way around. It's another approach. All right? So motor learning is very cool. It's different from motor development. They go together, and there's lots of things that as a developmental person I can use from motor learning literature to make my class more developmentally appropriate, right? And help skills develop. So make sure that you take a look at that chart. If it's not up there, it should be up there. If it's missing, let me know so I can make sure it is up there. If I did something like put a date on it to open and forgot to change the date,